Since Geiger's alien burst from John Hurt's chest in 1979, parasites have been a frequent part of creature design. Many alien aficionados, or indeed naturalists, will often tell you that there are many species with similar reproductive methods, and some that perhaps surpass the xenomorph. But a common trend for the more horror-slanted side of things is parasite, parasite-inspired or parasite-coded creatures that are still interested to some degree in consuming a hapless protagonist. So just how easy is it to climb from parasite to predator, or generally to upgrade to become Parasite Plus? One thing that can make answers difficult is the lack of available information on parasite evolution. Whilst parasitism has unsurprisingly been going on for a while, with fossil records from the Mesozoic, parasites rarely fossilise and are tiny, even on non-avian dinosaurs, making any hopes of piecing together family trees and evolutionary trends in deep time a long shot. Whilst they ostensibly evolved from free-living ancestors at least, one theory suggested is that some parasites evolved from predatory ancestors. In the case of mites, free-living predators of smaller invertebrates is believed to be the ancestral form, and this may be the case for other taxa too. Edward O. Wilson even said parasites were predators that eat prey in units of less than one. And with high-protein diets, on the surface there does seem to be some potential overlap. There are also facultative parasites too, that can and do live freely, but may become parasites as well. Snub-nosed eels count here, and whilst usually living as hagfish-like scavengers, they have been found in the heart of a mako shark, with numerous historical records of similar behaviours from large tablefish like halibut too, suggesting they may occasionally burrow into larger organisms for a change of lifestyle, especially with already sick or moribund ones. As you'd expect, facultative parasites have been suggested as a potential evolutionary stepping stone from free-living carnivores or predators to true parasitism. This is what they seem to be doing at least. With similar diets and some potential evolutionary history together, it may seem reasonable that many parasites should be able to simply hop back into predation. But that ignores the ridiculous level of specialism a lot of parasites undergo, either for parasitism or as a result of having things done for them. One example being the tapeworms, perhaps the poster child for parasites, often being literally immobile. Adults are essentially incapable of movement in many taxa, so how they'd be expected to chase anything down is beyond me. This isn't to say they couldn't become mobile once more, but that it's not likely or going to happen quickly. It probably is worth noting too, just how broad a term parasite is, and how many living things that encompasses. Not everyone is a glamorous, visible, big-game parasite like the cestoids after all. Parasites range from vertebrate mammals like vampire bats, to single-celled organisms like Plasmodium. Whilst of course you could make a predator derived from such an organism, it'd be so far removed much of the punchiness of the topic would be lost. So on this note, it's worth briefly going over the types of parasites and the ones most popular in fiction. Xenomorphs would be considered parasitoids. These are organisms which reproduce inside another organism, laying offspring inside it who then consume it on their way to maturity, and then very often kill it on exit or as a result of their feeding. Castrators are parasites that specialise in the genitals of their host, often replacing the mass or morphology of the immediate area and rendering the host infertile. For fairly obvious reasons, these are mostly untouched in fiction, though Geiger may be kicking himself from beyond the grave if he ever learned of them. Micropredators are the ones that tend to include higher organisms, and so include some mammals too. These are any animals which routinely feed, but don't live on, a host species without killing it. So good examples include mosquitoes and vampire bats. The occasionally bandied about notion of a flesh-grazing animal, or something that bites chunks out of larger animals without killing them, so like a cookie-cutter shark, would also apply. The other three are more defined by their entry points than by their methods, being direct, trophic, and vector-transmitted parasites. The latter need another species to deliver them to a host, so Plasmodium being transmitted by mosquitoes is a good example. Trophic is anything that needs to be eaten, so the pork tapeworm and indeed many cestoids are good examples there. Direct are any species that need a host to live on permanently, but can get themselves there without needing help. Lice and mites are good examples here. and these are often ectoparasites due to the difficulty of shoving yourself up somebody else's ass. It's also worth mentioning, in some circumstances, parasites can hold their own in fiction without needing to become Parasite Plus in any way too. Gears of War had a level inside the giant riftworm, where its natural parasites served as the level enemies. And similarly, Cloverfield has its weird little burst bugs that functioned seemingly as lice or mites on young Clover itself. The aggression seen to people may actually be aggression, as we'll cover in Parasites later, believing people to be rival parasites for Clover, rather than attempted predation. The effect of the bites could be explained this way too, with a substance that on a building-sized animal works as an anticoagulant, and on a human-sized human works as pop rocks in a carbonated drink. So with some of the legwork done, let's mull over some of the most popular examples of this trope, and the scaffolding of whether they could work or not. And then if fiction can help you out there too. One example that probably wears its ancestry on its mucus-laden bodily sleeve more so than other examples of this trope is Skull Island's Carnictis. The meat weasel is canonically a giant descended theropod worm, likely from either Vastatosaurus or its ancestors. In such instances, it's often tempting to point the finger at tapeworms, which Carnictis is described as similar to, as the parasite poster child and known for inhabiting the guts of their hosts. And whilst in fiction you can argue anything, tapeworms don't really resemble Carnictis at all. Whilst the scolex of a tapeworm may seem analogous to a head, it's more just used to attach the body to the intestinal wall. Tapeworms don't have a mouth or a digestive tract, and obtain nutrients by absorbing it from the body, unlike Carnictis, which actually has a gut and a stomach. The worm-like shape is made up of segmented and detachable proglottids that produce eggs at the tip, rather than being a fully formed body as they appear. They can also barely move with said body as well. This general uselessness on their own makes it hard to believe that tapeworms could ever survive outside the body to amount to anything other than a parasite. But it is worth noting that the conditions in the bug chasm are specific, as are the requirements for Carnictis in general. The chasms are fed from the bottom by warm, mineral-rich springs, and fed from the top by nutrients and debris-rich runoff from the leaf litter of the dense primary rainforest and the colonies of vulturesaurs above. So the thick soup at the bottom is already both a good temperature and stuffed with nutrients and minerals to be passively absorbed as tapeworms do. Carnictis are also dependent on a reasonable supply of meat, be it living or dead, and would undergo localized extinctions of adults without it, as well as any Carnictis that left their pits dying in the cool exposed waters as well. Tempting as it is to try and find other parasites, you may as well use tapeworms still, as other forms of worm are often just as specialized. All of Cestodes lack guts, and the platyhelminths lack body cavities. With its actual gut and muscular toothed maw, Carnictis is really morphologically very different. It could be tempting to reframe it as a leech or some other weird invertebrate, and you could do this for sure. But this would also rather ignore its deliberately macabre origins, though a giant leech probably is the best fit for Carnictis morphologically at a glance. Rather, despite superficial resemblances, it seems difficult to try and chalk Carnictis up to any one family, and is better explained by the divergences 66 million years of evolution can bring. Some time ago, the notion of such a transitionary period being accessible for a parasite, and an ecosystem resembling a giant's stomach, would have been met with much skepticism. But recent research suggests it may not be so far-fetched. With the discovery of the hippo metagut, where hippos constantly defecating into small water bodies causes the water to resemble the microbial makeup of a hippo's stomach, with possible positive consequences for other living things that benefit from it digestion-wise too, it now sounds a lot more plausible. Oh, Dutton et al., if only you knew the boon you granted Spec Evo. But there is still a lot to consider. For a start, the loading of hippo dung is constant, and supported by resident pods of hippos, over a ton in weight who are bulk grazers. You'd struggle to arrange a similar situation with carnivores realistically. And if you wanted a parasite-descended predator, you'd need an omnivorous or carnivorous diet, presumably. But it's not impossible for a similar situation with a helping hand from the exaggeration of fiction. Predator traps are quite rare phenomena in nature, existing more in the fossil record than in a modern ecosystem. But exist they did. The La Brea tar pits is the best known example overall. and seem to get a fairly high turnover of scavenging carnivores, with direwolves and smilodon being the most frequent deceased diners. Whilst the loading certainly wouldn't have been on par with hippo dung, it would likely be a semi-regular stream of carnivore gut contents, and likely feces too, into a warm environment, presumably with ample carrion as well. La Brea is about as close as you'd be able to get, and for a fictional world, a similar situation is the best excuse you'd get. Presumably, Skull Island's chasms were similar at one point, with the occasional stray herbivore wandering in to die, and then the stench attracting carnivores to the chasm edges, where some fell to their death, thus providing the initial brood of worms. At the time of the film, the chasm still presumably stinks, but doesn't function as a full-blown predator trap, and more just random chance pitfalls, due to the odour of the invertebrates inside, as well as the speed of which any carrion would be consumed. In terms of their predatory aptitude, Carnictis aren't especially competent, living as much or more on carrion killed in the fall, rather than actively hunting, and still being slow and sluggish, Carnictis are as limited in morphology as they are in range. Actual kills occur more from moribund prey or crippled animals, or ones that literally fall right into the midst of them. So overall, Carnictis' low predatory aptitude would probably slot them more into parasite cum scavenger, over parasite cum pure predator. But they still do enough predation to still qualify for an interesting examination in this trope. Ironically, in escaping parasitism, the Carnictis are now subject to it themselves, being the host for the baby arachnoclaws they share the caverns with, who live in their guts until molting into the tiny adult forms, and exiting via the rectum as trophically transmitted parasites. One of the most popular and well-known parasitoids mentioned in the opening is of course Giger's xenomorph, star of the Alien films and the unfortunate runoff to come from that franchise too. They're seemingly a eusocial group of organisms with a single breeding queen and then her sterile drones, with the embryos oddly being formed and carried in sterile vectors known as facehuggers to implant the drone and future queen embryos. Some properties have variations on drones like Praetorians, and the ridge-headed drones are often identified as soldiers too. Parasitoids are nothing new in nature, with many species essentially having identical growth processes to xenomorphs once laid. The most unusual thing about the process in xenomorphs is the size, obviously with known parasitoids that singly kill their hosts not using large vertebrates, and those that use large vertebrates having small bodies in comparison, like botflies. That the chestburster seems to obligately kill its host on birth is unusual. Considering the relatively small size relative to the host, it doesn't feel impossible they could take a less lethal exit. Though the fact this happens without the chest bursting in larger hosts still suggests they may eat or atrophy major organs prior to emergence, making them lethal past a certain age anyway. The evolution of parasitoids is interesting, and actually seems to stem from the families often killing each other for fungal resources they initially wanted for their young before adapting to eat the victims of this violence instead. Not so with flies though, who were originally scavengers. It's an easy jump from laying your eggs on the dead to laying your eggs on the living, and either could work for xenomorphs. But it's hard to conclude much due to how little is really known about their homeworld, and the fact they'll often bring hosts back alive can be considered evidence for either suggestion too. As some parasitoids do, you can also move past that behaviour from pure predation as well. Presumably, Monster Hunter's carnivorous predatory parasitoid Kezu went down this line, with the ability to capture prey for itself via corrosive saliva or electricity, and then eventually wound up using these traits to mass provision for its offspring too. Some time ago, the greatest surprise with xenomorphs would rather be their sociality, being compared often to ants or bees, which is not how parasites often roll. But recent papers on trematodes have shown how life can imitate art. One species, Haplorchus pumilio, has a single breeding female that, whilst not quite the same, can be considered analogous to a queen, who creates legions of sterile pumilio. Whilst there are the normie workers, they will often create warriors too. Worms with larger mouthparts designed to latch onto other trematodes and suction their innards out. And this unique social structure and evolution does help. Pumilio often wipes out other trematodes in the area, and dominates the microecosystems through their warrior caste, with the worms only really not going for other Pumilio. This really is a lot like the xenomorphs, and it stems from similar reasonings, with their snail fortress and sole reproductive female The sessile breeder and resource tends to select for the evolution of warrior castes as in eusocial insects. Thus, the immobile xenomorph queen would need defending so she could keep producing eggs, and such she created the drones and warriors. Now, to come full circle, it can almost be considered that any one aspect of xenomorph life history isn't that odd, but it's much more all of them being piled into one animal. With flight, fire, a lashing tail, and then teeth and claws too, a dragon is over-equipped for essentially any opponent. So some interpretations of dragons consider them the ultimate predatory threat, combining aspects of birds, big cats, or snakes and crocodiles to make them the ultimate human menace for both fear and a foe for heroes to vanquish. In this same way, xenomorphs, which are compared to dragons in some narratives, can perhaps be considered the ultimate parasitic threat. Whilst there's fairly unending examples of parasites having negative effects on the host, can they ever be a pro over a con? And maybe. Toxoplasma is a very well-known protozoan parasite, famed for its effects on behaviour, often being compared to being a crazy cat lady. But it also affects animals too. Species that don't really want to encounter felids, like mice or chimpanzees, lose their fear of felid odours, making lethal encounters more likely, because Toxoplasma can only breed in a cat. But in some other species like wolves, it can actually lead to success. Wolves infected with Toxoplasma are a lot more likely to become the breeding or alpha pairs of packs, believed to be due to how Toxoplasma can often correlate with increases in boldness. This isn't perfect, as these same behavioural changes may also make wolves a lot more likely to die under the wheels of a vehicle or from a hunter's bullet, but it also increases dispersal behaviours too, which is the first step in becoming the breeding pair. It's also believed, like in humans, Toxoplasma can cause birth defects in other mammals, such as wolves. But it is interesting. Becoming the breeding individual is essentially the top goal for any wolf, and mammals in general. And the fact the parasite facilitates this success is worth consideration. There are evolutionary breaks on it. The miscarriages for one, hamstring breeding success. And most importantly, wolves aren't the final host, but rather they can depress numbers of the final host in the area through competitive dominance. There's little research done on how or if Toxoplasma affects cat behaviour, so whether any of the felids could receive such benefits is unknown. Parasites as a buff isn't a novel idea, and things like the Venom symbiote or the Las Plagas from Resident Evil certainly make their hosts notably more formidable, but also cause social and societal collapse from behavioural changes that ultimately cancel out any long-term cohabitation. There are clearly some kinks to iron out, but Toxoplasma does show that the notion of parasites improving a host to a degree isn't so far-fetched. Here the changes are also behavioural, and fictional buffs are more commonly physical. Outside of atrophy and consumption, parasites can physically change hosts for ways you could argue make them more powerful. And in a lot of cases, this is more done by castrators, who turn their hosts into factory fortresses for their own kind, verbatim the term used to describe the effect H. pumilio has on snails, causing them to grow larger and their shells to thicken as well, to make them more resilient to any predators. A quote-unquote improvement to both morphology and behaviour, without massive and/or game-ending physiological costs, is so far unseen in reality. And due to the role parasites play in fiction, is rarely the case there either. The most notable exception, of course, being that one episode of Futurama, where Fry gets the worms that essentially make him the Giga Chad. On this note, there is occasionally the theme of parasite turned symbiote as well, as seen in All Tomorrows, where some of the assorted humanoid parasites do eventually gain sentience, and then even selectively breed their hosts into meat mechs, which accelerates notably past symbiote into something new entirely. Interestingly, the initial broods did seem to be from several branches of parasitism, with castrators, micropredators and direct transfers being described, of which it seems the latter grew to full success with. Some real families do also show examples of this trope straight too. Leeches perhaps as the best example. It's believed leeches diverged from a freshwater and blood-sucking ancestor that was the first true leech, and around half have since turned to predation, either draining prey completely or swallowing them whole. Whilst the actual pathways to becoming predatory aren't known, they are an example of a parasite of the micropredator class becoming a full-blown predator. Micropredators in general probably represent the best odds of doing so imminently, just due to their strong mobility and need to at least partially process hosts to get at whatever resource they're extracting from them. Evolutionary changes can be surprisingly swift too, with vampire bats becoming vampires in a relatively short space of time, despite the adaptations needed. Though the initial prompt to change from insectivore to sanguivore is not really speculated upon. Though personally, the notion of something like an oxpecker bat as a transitionary form would probably be my best guess. Whilst there is a general rush to make Parasites Plus, it is worth noting this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. There is no real reason for them to evolve any further than they are a lot of the time, as parasitism is an evolutionarily stable strategy, and has been so for millennia. To look at the trope of Parasite Plus, they also often generally hinge on retaining that core iconography to secure thrills in an audience too. Thanks for watching, and thanks as ever to my patrons. Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Super Stuper, DJ, My Best Friend Loba, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Kieran McCarthy, Flagon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Roberto Hernandez, Big Man Blastoise, Nathan Cross, Johnny, Oni, Tim Gojira, Teddy KGB, Insert Nickname, Waffle, Slashmaster 101, Dapperaptor, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Small Squid, Littengamer 111, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu, who help keep the channel going with their generosity. I don't know why both this and the last Spec Evo short were so horror themed, but here we are. This also isn't the promised bug video, but that will be the next one of these. Really, I just wanted to make one that wasn't too long, but dealt with what I felt was a reasonably interesting topic. Originally, this video just broke things down a lot more in a case-by-case basis, but some examples of such tropes ultimately had a lot more lore than others to work with, so it became more of a meandering look at things, but oh well. Next week another non-Monster Hunter video, before turning to Wilds to cover some more of the roster. Hopefully I'll see you there for it.